All right, Taylor, thanks for that introduction. My name's Adam Kehler, and I work for Online Business Systems. I'm an information security consultant. And today I wanted to talk about current cybersecurity attacks in healthcare and how to prevent them. All right, so let's start with the threat landscape. So I'll pull from a few different sources here. There are a few organizations that really do a great job of doing some research in information security and putting out annual reports. And many of them are very targeted to different industries and sectors. So starting with McAfee Labs, this is a 2018-2019 report. So I'm not sure if the report is out for this year yet. But as you can see on the left-hand side here, healthcare is right up there with the other sectors, the other top sectors, as far as a targeted sector. And the reason for that, many people will say, is for two reasons. Number one, the maturity of cybersecurity in healthcare is well behind other sectors such as finance, federal, technology. I think healthcare and maybe law enforcement are the only two industries that still predominantly use fax as a means of transmitting information. And many of you, if you're students, you may not even remember fax machines, but they're still out there. And as I walk through healthcare organizations, hospitals, doctors' offices, they're still there. You walk through and there's the fax machine and it's shooting out faxes just like it was probably 10 years ago. So as far as technology maturity, healthcare is way behind. But as far as the value of the information, they hold some of the most valuable information. As far as you'll hear different numbers for the cost of a medical record on the black market, anywhere from $5 to $50, whereas a credit card number might get you 50 cents. So you've got high value information and low maturity and security controls makes for a ripe target for attackers. And we'll talk a little bit later about who those attackers are and what their incentives are. On the right-hand side, you can see how these attacks are happening. Number one, by and large, is malware. And number two, right behind it, account hijacking. So these are two things that are very indicators of malicious intent and outsiders. So malicious outsiders are generally the top attack vector. We do want to consider insider threats and accidental threats and things like that, but by and large, this is the main avenue of attack in healthcare. So again, just reiterating a little bit from that last chart, I think anyone who follows the news in this industry will understand that ransomware is a huge issue in healthcare. It's a huge issue across the board, but specifically has found its home in healthcare, again, because I think it finds a little bit of easier way to enter organizations because of that lack of maturity. And people who are putting the ransomware out there understand the value of the information. Especially in healthcare, you've seen the ransom demands go from maybe a few $100s upwards of now six figures and hundreds of thousands of dollars, because they've realized that from the healthcare industry, they can get these numbers because many healthcare organizations have no choice but to pay that ransom due to a lack of maturity in their data recovery. So if you're looking across industries, one thing specific to healthcare is certainly that proliferation of ransomware. All right, so this chart comes from Deloitte, again, another industry source of great information. It's very specific to healthcare. And they looked at the 4 top threats in healthcare and who the threat actors are. So one thing that's interesting is, again, the ransomware, talking about that, is largely criminal organizations. And these people, their incentive is financial. It's strictly financial. How big a ransom can we get for that information? And understanding the intent of the threat actors can sometimes help you in protection against the threat. So that's why it's important to talk about this. The other 3 areas, theft of PHI. So that could be a variety of different means. It could be through social engineering. It could be through malware that exfiltrates information. It could be compromising an insider. But theft, the PHI in healthcare, the protected health information, is generally the #1 target when we're talking about the type of information that healthcare organizations hold. So that's the patient information. Intellectual property is also a huge target in healthcare. And that's things like in biomed and sciences and healthcare technology. These areas are a huge target. So it's not just about protecting the medical records and the health information, but we also need to look at that intellectual property as well and make sure that it's treated as a critical asset to the organization. And finally, across the threat sources, what we'll see is a growing target toward vulnerable medical devices. So in general, it's IoT, but when we're talking about healthcare, we're specifically looking at medical devices. And the proliferation of medical devices has made them a huge target, especially because in general with technology, when there's a new technology out on the market, it's first about functionality and then about security. So as these new medical devices have come on the market, the focus hasn't been necessarily on security, it's been on getting these devices on the market. And then the security comes behind. So we're starting to get more of a focus on medical device security, but in the meantime, they're a huge target. And it's not just the information on the medical device that's a target, it's using medical devices to pivot to other parts of the organization. Using another industry example, but could be very relevant to healthcare, there was a casino in Las Vegas, and they got, you can imagine their assets are fairly large as far as what's in their systems. They got exploited through their fish tank thermometer. So someone set up a fish tank, plugged in a thermometer, it was internet connected, it got exploited, and from there they were able to pivot to the other parts of the network to get to the more sensitive systems. And this is the same concept in healthcare. You have a heart monitor that, maybe the attacker doesn't really care about the heart monitor, but what they care about is being able to exploit it so they can pivot to the rest of the network. So we're going to talk about some ways to help protect against those types of threats. But as you can see, 3 of those 4 sectors are also criminal, but also state-sponsored actors. We're seeing a huge proliferation of attacks from I won't pick on any specific countries, but from certain countries of state-sponsored attacks, and those generally aren't financial in their incentives. It's more about information gathering, human intelligence, and then at some later date being able to use that information for their benefit, whether it be identity theft or actually targeting those individuals for things like blackmail and things like that. So again, I mentioned that the landscape in information security changes frequently. And you can't have a conversation these days without talking about COVID, so I thought I better put a slide in there. But if I gave this presentation 6 months ago, this slide wouldn't be here. We didn't even know, the word COVID, or certainly 8 months ago. So it's something that in information security, we constantly have to be looking at new threats and how has the threat landscape changed. So for example, we are now seeing this pivot to remote workforce. So we've got more remote connections, we've got more personal devices connected, we've got more public-facing systems. And as the technology landscape changes, as people get more remote, the attackers change their vectors. And so we have to respond to those changes in attack techniques. So what we're seeing is certainly more COVID-related phishing attacks. So phishing attacks will usually follow world events, and this is no exception. So we're seeing so many attacks related to whether it be incentive dollars or promise of a vaccine or some miracle treatment or something, just anything to get you to click on that link. And the attacks are have generally been on the rise in that regard. We've also seen a rapid adoption of telemedicine, which is great. It's been long overdue, in my opinion. I think it's a great model for care for certain situations. But the problem is, as I said before, as we adopt new technologies, the security usually comes later. And one thing we saw right away was that Health and Human Services and the Office for Civil Rights said that we are going to pause enforcement of HIPAA for telemedicine adoption, which is great. It allowed organizations to adopt it readily, get it out there quickly. But the problem is they kind of saw that as a waiver and a get out of jail free card to actually address information security. So now we've got all these telemedicine systems that have been pushed out there as fast as they possibly could. And probably they didn't take time to step back and say, what are the threats to these systems and how can we secure them appropriately? So now we have a lot of vulnerability with these telemedicine systems that were very rapidly adopted. So again, getting back to that threat-based scenario. So we've kind of seen what the change in the landscape is. We've kind of seen some of the incentives. And now I want to get kind of down to brass tacks a little bit. There's one document out there, and I have a link in here. Anyone who's interested in kind of understanding more about the threat landscape in health information security should probably read this document. It's referred to as the HICCUP document, Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices. It was an outcome of the Cybersecurity Act of 2015. They were required to put out this guidance. And it's really, in my mind, it's some of the best guidance that's come out of Health and Human Services and the Office for Civil Rights. And I think it was a joint venture between a number of different industry players. So what they did is they said, here are the top 5 threats in healthcare. And I think these pretty much align with some of the other things that we'll see in the presentation. But as we talked about, phishing and ransomware, number 1 and 2. I mean, it doesn't matter what report you read, that's what you're going to see is phishing and ransomware. So organizations in healthcare must be addressing these as part of their risk assessment, as part of their risk management plans, because it's unavoidable. Every organization is a target to these 2 things. Some other information or some other threats that may or may not be surprising: loss or theft of equipment or data. Generally, lost laptops and lost smartphones. It's been a problem since we've seen it since the breach notification started back in 2010. Lost laptops have constantly been an issue, and unfortunately, it's often lost laptops that are not encrypted, and that's where you see the breaches happening. Encryption actually provides a safe harbor against breach notification. We'll talk about that a little more later. But essentially, if you have these devices out in the field, which we do more and more now because we're all working remote, we're going to see an increase in loss or theft of equipment. Insider and accidental intentional data loss. So this is still a prevalent threat. Even though we saw it wasn't the biggest one, it's not up there with ransomware and email and phishing. But essentially, things like people inadvertently emailing PHI or people sending PHI to the wrong destination, inadvertently leaving, having inappropriate permissions on file shares, or things like your Google Drive or OneDrive, unintentionally leaving them open, misconfiguring firewalls, things like this, just things that people are doing with the data day in, day out are leading to breaches, and those threats need to be addressed as well. And then finally, as I talked about earlier, internet-connected medical devices. The rapid adoption has led to a considerable threat there, so those need to be considered as well. So the great thing about this HICCUP document is what it does, it lays out the top 5 threats, and then it talks about the most effective security controls to address those threats. So we'll get to those a little bit later. All right, so just a word about the HIPAA security rule. I'm sure you heard lots about this in previous presentations, but I want to make sure that we tie this back, because in healthcare security, a lot of it is related to HIPAA, and it always ties back to HIPAA. So I've been talking a lot about threats and reasonable security controls to address those threats. And I want to demonstrate that that approach is exactly what's required by the HIPAA security rule. It requires you to do a security risk assessment and identify, and they use this term, reasonably anticipated threats to the security or integrity of ePHI. And risk analysis is the way to do that. So in your risk analysis, I see a lot of organizations that do a risk analysis, and what it really is, it's just it's more of a gap analysis. It's an evaluation of how are your security controls? Are they good? Are they not? Do you do this? Do you do this? Do you do this? Do you do this? What the HIPAA security rule actually requires is you identify your critical assets and your locations of your EPHI, and then take this step, which I feel like a lot of organizations miss, which is identify those reasonably anticipated threats, and then you can identify your reasonable and appropriate security controls to address those threats, and that's the risk management plan. So the HIPAA security rule is not prescriptive. It doesn't say you have to have passwords of this length and you have to monitor for these events and do this and use this exactly this encryption. It requires that you do reasonable and appropriate security, which can make it hard to know when you're complying. Like, am I HIPAA compliant? I don't know. Is this reasonable and appropriate? So what you need to do is to show that you're compliant is to show that you've addressed these reasonably anticipated threats and put in appropriate security controls. If you can demonstrate that, you are well on your way to being able to demonstrate that you're HIPAA compliant. So I just wanted to align that back to HIPAA there for a minute. So again, as part of our risk analysis for HIPAA, we're saying we've identified certain threats, and certainly those top 5 threats, I'm going to go back a little bit, because these top 5 threats have been identified as pervasive in healthcare. It would behoove organizations to certainly consider at least these 5 threats in their security risk assessment and identify appropriate security controls to protect against these top 5 threats. Not to say that should be only these top 5, but these certainly should be in the risk analysis. Okay. So again, getting back to the HICcup document, these are the top 10 things that they've said can help protect against those 5 threats. And in the document, they actually map these security controls to the specific threats. And we're not going to go through these one by one. What we're going to do is we're going to take a bit of a higher level approach just in the interest of time. Everyone's welcome to go and read that document. But I'm going to pull from another source here as well. The Center for Internet Security Top 20 Security Controls. These are across industries. It's not healthcare specific. But these are 20 security controls that, according to the industry, and this has gained a lot of industry adoption, cybersecurity industry adoption. So a lot of people tie back to these. But they've said if you do these 20 things, you're in a very good space as far as protecting against reasonable threats. And within those 20, they've narrowed it down to if you just do these 6 things, you're going to protect against most threats. So what I've done here is I've taken those 6 things and you'll see, I'll align them with the recommendations in the HICcup document because there's a lot of overlap there. And we can kind of gain some kind of common themes as far as where organizations should be focusing their efforts. And then what I've done on this slide here is I've also aligned it to the requirements of the HIPAA security rules. So you can see that it aligns quite well. Okay, so you can see on the left-hand side here, I've got the reference, and I've referenced HICcup and CIS, and you will be able to see in most areas that there's a lot of alignment between the two. And then what I've tried to do is kind of pull together common themes and guidance. So I'm not going to read through these slides line by line. I think you can do that yourself if you choose. Taylor, I assume we're providing these slides to people if they want them. I see nodding. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through these different areas and just kind of talk about them briefly. So the first kind of theme is hardening your network. Your network is the basis for everything. If an attacker gains access to your network, they've got access to everything. You just kind of have to assume it. They can sniff your traffic. They can poke around at your servers and try and get access to your servers. They can monkey with network traffic. Your network is the basis of everything. So step 1 in security is understanding what you have, and you'll see this is a common theme. If you don't have an inventory of systems, network boundaries, data flows, things like that, you can't protect it. You can't manage it. So make sure you understand, and this might seem intuitive, but many organizations really fail at this step. really understanding where your network boundaries are, where the boundaries between your trusted and untrusted networks are, and then you can start to protect it. I'm going to focus here on network segmentation. This is an area that a lot of organizations I talk to, they think, well, we're too small for that. That's for the larger enterprises. Or we have a network already in place and it would be impossible to go back and segment it now because it's too complex and we would break things. To me, the short answer to that is those are excuses for not doing it. And I've seen organizations do this very successfully on legacy networks, I think actually smaller networks are probably easier to do it on. What you do is you do it by bits and pieces. So the first thing I would do in network segmentation, going back to our threats, is I would take all medical devices and place them on their own network segment that can't talk to anything else, and they can't even talk to each other. It's called a private VLAN. And then you open up only what those medical devices need to talk to. Maybe it's a server, maybe it's something out on the internet, and you whitelist that traffic. Those medical devices as we saw, they're a huge target, and they're used to pivot to other places in the network. And they shouldn't need to, your medical devices shouldn't have the ability to talk to your printers and your workstations and all that stuff, unless it's explicitly needed. So why do we allow it? So step one, take all your medical devices, put them on a dedicated network segment, don't allow them to talk to anything, put them in quarantine in today's speak. Also look at your facility, your badge readers, your cameras, put them all on a separate network and don't allow them to talk to anything. Badge readers are a great way. I don't know if anyone has watched Mr. Robot, but it's probably one of the most realistic hacking shows or movies I've seen on TV. They use the badge reader to get into the hospital network. They just pulled the network wire, and it's realistic. I mean, that does happen, and it has happened. So take all your facility, your HVAC, everything, put it on its own network, your phones, and then you can kind of target your servers and the harder stuff. I would say these things I listed are the easiest stuff and probably the highest bang for your buck as far as getting them off of your network. Then you can look at disabling workstation to workstation communication, because why should my laptop be able to talk to your laptop? It doesn't need to. And with ransomware and a lot of the malware, it comes in through the endpoint. So if my laptop gets infected, I don't want that malware being able to poke at everyone else's laptops and trying to infect everything else. Only allow workstation to server communication. In the past, we used to have all these peer-to-peer networks and all that stuff, and it was needed. It's not needed anymore. So just completely disable it. It'll help protect, again, it's that trying to isolate the malware at the entry point and not allowing it to pivot to other parts of the network. And these are some very effective ways to do that. Also limit your third parties. Home Depot, their breach came through their HVAC vendor. So again, segment off your HVAC, limit what your third parties can access so that if they have a breach, it can't propagate to your network. Some of the other ones I think are more common sense, locking your closets and segmenting your guest networks. I will say something about IDS and IPS, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention systems. Again, a lot of organizations I talk to think, well, that's an enterprise thing. Our organization isn't big enough to do that. The short answer is most firewalls you buy these days have these capabilities built in. You may have to purchase a subscription, but I mean, as far as understanding where the traffic is on your network and being able to block threats, it's a great way to do it, and they should be able to continuously update their threat information, which means that your organization is continually adapting to new threats. So I recommend everyone, it doesn't matter what kind of firewall you have, if it's any kind of enterprise level firewall, do I have my IDS and IPS capabilities turned on, and am I using them? Still on hardening your network, configuration standards definitely a core control and aren't as hard as people think. Again, I'm going to focus here on patching and multi-factor authentication. So across the board, I believe I recently saw a stat: 65% of successful attacks take advantage of vulnerabilities for which a patch is available. That means if you've just been patching your system, you prevent against 65% of these attacks, more than half. So patching is probably one of the main things an organization can do, and isn't always as easy as they think. But usually they're doing their Windows updates and things like that. But think about your network devices. They have vulnerabilities as well. Make sure you're patching those. Your switches, your routers. Anything that has an operating system or an application level system to it, you should be looking at a patch strategy. It's not to say that you're going to patch the second it comes out, but really have a strategy in place to evaluate patches and do it in a well thought out manner. Also, a lot of organizations don't have multi-factor authentication for managing their network devices or remote logins. And as we know, passwords are a poor way to do authentication. More and more multi-factor authentication should be used for all authentication to sensitive systems, whether it's remote logins, VPN, remote access to your EMR, but also your network devices, which are one of your most critical assets. You really should be using MFA to authenticate to the management console on those. Pardon me. All right, so now we've talked about the network. Let's move to hardening systems. So starting at the endpoint, we talked about what are the threats. They're essentially phishing and ransomware often comes in through a phishing attack. So the endpoint, the laptop, the workstation, that is what is generally the entry point of a phishing attack. They send you the phishing email, you click on the link or open the attachment, and that maybe takes advantage of a vulnerability or gets you to install some software. And once it's installed on your system, then it starts to try and propagate through the network, whether through file shares or, like I said, scanning the network and whatever your laptop can access, it will try and infiltrate. So what we really want to do is, number one, protect the endpoint, and then protect the rest of the network from being propagated from that endpoint. So a few very core controls for protecting those endpoints, and as you can see, these are referenced both by the HICCUP and by numerous CIS recommendations. Don't run as administrator. If I'm running as administrator and I click on a malicious link, that link has my administrative privileges and can do basically anything on that workstation. If I'm running under a limited account, it will have a lot more work to do. I won't say it's impossible, but it'll have a lot more work to do to try and infiltrate that laptop. So people should not generally be running as a local administrator. If you have a separate account that's an administrative account that you log into when you need to. Again, patching. Most phishing attacks and ransomware, they're taking advantage of known vulnerabilities. So not only doing your Windows updates, but Adobe and Java are two notorious products that there are constantly critical vulnerabilities coming out for. So how are you patching at the application level in addition to the operating system level? So generally, in order to do this effectively, you need a centralized patching system. Antivirus, I think everyone knows about antivirus. I don't need to talk about that. Endpoint encryption, encrypting your laptops. This actually protects against more of the lost device. It's more of encryption is actually often more of a physical security control than it is technical, because it protects against physical threats. It protects against me losing my laptop and someone getting access to that data. Doesn't matter if there's a password on it. The only way to really protect the information on that laptop is through encryption. And the HIPAA breach notification rule, and actually most other breach notification rules, have a carve out or a safe harbor for encryption. So if I lose that laptop but it's encrypted, I don't have to go through breach notification, because it's basically been deemed that through strong encryption, it's not feasible someone could actually access that information. So whether it's a laptop, a USB drive, an external hard drive, a smartphone, a tablet, doesn't matter what it is, make sure you enable encryption, make sure the information on that device is encrypted. There's a few other protections for browsers, email clients, and AV scans. Again, asset inventory, so hardware and software inventory are critical to managing and protecting your systems. You can't secure what you don't know you have. And so step 1 and 2, and you can see in CIS, step 1 is hardware inventory, step 2 is software inventory. You can't do all the other things if you don't have those nailed down. So yeah, I mean, if you're starting on your security program, that's the place to start. Okay, we talked about dedicated administrative accounts. A couple of things that people generally don't focus on are actually DNS filtering. You can not only can you can protect against a lot of threats. You know, if someone does click on that malicious phishing link, but their DNS system is actually has a list of malicious domains, it can actually help provide that safety net. So I click on it, my DNS server says, "Oh, that's a known malicious domain," based on industry sources, and it's automatically updating. It can actually say, "Sorry, we're not going to take you to that link because we think it's malicious." It's a great second level protection. The other thing DNS filtering can do is actually monitoring for something reaching out and trying to get to one of these malicious domains. So we can say, "Hey, we're seeing all these DNS requests from that laptop. What's going on?" You go and you look and you find the laptop has malware on it. So yeah, look at your DNS. And then email, I was just talking to a client about this yesterday. Implementing DMARC, which is an email integrity system, it ties your email and your DNS systems together, provides a lot of protection against spoofing and malicious senders. I did this myself with another domain I was managing. I was having a huge issue with people spoofing my domain, and I would get all these people complaining that I was sending them spam. The second I implemented DMARC, it all went away. It's just a great protection against that. So it can help protect the reputation of your organization as well. Keep an eye on the clock here. Vulnerability management. This is another area, unfortunately, I see a lot of smaller organizations saying, like, we don't have the means to conduct all these vulnerability scans and testing and things like that. And I gotta say, it's gotten really easy. You go out to a site like Tenable, you sign up. They've got really good plans for SMBs. You put in your external IP address range, tell it to scan weekly, and every Monday morning you get a report in your inbox. And if all of a sudden you do have a critical vulnerability on your perimeter, you want to know about it right away. And if you're not doing these types of scans, you won't know about it. So, set it up. It's automated. It doesn't require a lot of work. It's not that expensive, but it provides you that great level of comfort that you don't have critical vulnerabilities on your internet-facing presence. So, I mean, these other areas are important as well. Remediating the flaws based on the CVE levels, doing web application scanning if you have custom web applications. But really, the routine scanning is the best way to detect vulnerabilities, and routine patching is the best way to protect against vulnerabilities. So organizations don't have to have a huge fancy vulnerability management program in place, but you should have something and some kind of focus and reasonable to the size of your organization. Sorry, I'm getting a really dry throat here. I know it looks like I'm in cell block 5 here. It's just a meeting room here in my co-working space, so I'm not actually calling in from prison. But wouldn't that be cool if I was? All right, just a few more areas of focus, and then I'll open up for some discussion. Logging and monitoring. This is another area where I see a lot of organizations not focusing enough on. They're focusing a lot of efforts on prevention and how do we keep the bad guys out, and how do we protect our systems from being breached. Unfortunately, in this day and age, you have to assume you're going to be breached. You're going to get malware on your systems. Something is going to happen. It's just a fact of being in this kind of threat landscape. So what the important thing is that you don't just give up, and but you don't just focus on prevention. You do your preventative, as much as is reasonable. But then we also need to be able to detect breaches, because the sooner you detect it and respond to it, the more you can mitigate the effects. So it's really, I mean, 3 steps. Activate your audit logs. Make sure, and you can tune them. And CIS baselines have some good recommendations for tuning audit logs. You don't want, in some cases, it's reducing your audit logs because you don't want too much noise. So you have to set them to appropriate levels. But step 1, activate your audit logging. Step 2, centralize your logs. So get them off the servers, get them off the network devices into a central location. It may be a cloud-based system, it may be on-prem. But centralize your audit logs to somewhere where you can start to evaluate them. Make sure you have enough space allocated to it. You have to kind of baseline, well, how fast are our audit logs growing? Make sure you have a retention policy. So if we want to have audit logs for 30 days, how much storage do we need for 30 days of audit logs? So get them all together. Step 3 is to deploy a SIM or log analytics tool. Again, doesn't have to be fancy enterprise level. There are some very effective, cost-effective tools out there. You just have to go and look for them and start using them. There's also a lot of outsourcers now that do managed security services. You can talk to me about those if you like. But you need something looking at, it's not enough to just have your audit logs. You need to actually be using them. So deploy the SIM, and then that was step 3. I guess there's 4. I said there were 3 steps, there's actually 4. Step 4 is to actually start looking at what's coming out of the SIM. Now what's going to happen is you're going to start drinking from a fire hose. You're going to say, oh, there's too much alerts and everything's coming at me. So you need to start whitelisting things and start tuning it. It is a process and it's going to take a little while. But don't get overwhelmed. It's just a matter of doing it. You start whitelisting things. You start focusing on specific events. Again, go back to what you think your threats are and then start to monitor against those threats and come up with reporting and some alerting that can do that. So if I'm starting to see weird traffic coming out of a medical device, that's probably something we need to look at. I'm seeing a high number of failed logins or a high amount of network traffic coming from something. We need to go and start looking at it. So don't get overwhelmed by the fire hose. Just start targeting what you're looking at through your SIM. Or again, work with a third party that is kind of experienced in this area. Okay, encryption at rest. I touched on this earlier, so I won't spend too much time on it. But again, this provides safe harbor against breach notification. I've had clients ask me, they say, well, what should we do for protection of our laptops out in the field? We bought this remote white software, and we think that would be a good thing to help protect against breaches. But really, I mean, if you're going to focus your efforts, focus it on encryption, because it'll provide you that safe harbor. It'll provide you assurance that if something's lost, you don't have to worry about what was on it. So look at your backups, look at your USB storage, look at your mobile devices, look at anything that's really movable. And then look at your servers. How are you encrypting data on your servers, especially if you're in the cloud? How are you protecting your information so your cloud provider can't access it? Everything should use AES 256, and FIPS 140-2 is a good reference for if you're looking for a standard to make sure that you're using appropriate encryption. Okay, I think this is the last one. Let me skip ahead. Yeah. So the last area referenced by these documents is data recovery. And this is, and I title this, or how to recover from ransomware. Because most times when you see that organizations have paid a ransom, it's because they didn't have proper data recovery security controls in place. So if I get infected by ransomware, which is a high likelihood it's going to happen, and I have proper backups, I can just restore from my backups, and away I go. I don't have to pay the ransom. So that's why people often don't think as backup as a security control, but it really is, because it protects the integrity and availability of your information. So people are often like, yeah, we have our backups running, we're good. Unfortunately, it goes a little bit beyond that. First of all, you have to make sure your backups are completely separate from your production systems. What's happened in a lot of ransomware attacks is they infect the production system, but they don't run yet. They wait till they can properly infect the backups, and then they lock both up so that you can't recover from your backups. So your backups have to be offline or inaccessible from your production systems, because otherwise you're liable to lose both, and then you can't recover. So make sure that they're offline, and then also perform full restoration tests of your critical systems. So that doesn't just mean, hey, can I restore this one back up? Yeah, it looks good, or it was tested when it was backed up. Actually say, okay, we've got our full EMR system that has these 5 servers in it. Can I take my backups and bring up a copy of my EMR system and actually use it? Because often what happens is you bring up your offline system or your backup system, you restore it, and then you realize, oh, I wasn't backing up this piece of critical information, or these encryption keys over here don't match up, or I'm having a problem with my licenses and it's not working. So go through a full restoration, I would say at least annually, to make sure that not only are you backing up everything you need, but your restoration processes are in place to make sure you don't run into those hiccups. And the only way to find those hiccups is to actually go through a restoration. And you don't want that first restoration to be in the middle of a ransomware attack. So that would be my guidance there. All right, so I think I've rambled on for long enough. Hopefully you stuck with me. So just to summarize kind of everything is, you can't do and you shouldn't have to do everything in information security. Take a threat-based approach. Look at what your threats are, where your critical information is, and focus your effort against protecting against those threats. And there's some great information out there to help you do that. The hiccup document's good. These industry reports are great. Come up with a list of realistic threats and look at the guidance on the effective security controls for protecting against those threats. And certainly, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Use common frameworks, use healthcare-specific industry information, and you should be able to pull together a fairly good plan for addressing reasonable threats in a reasonable and appropriate manner, which is what's required by the HIPAA security rule and is the basis for good information security. So Taylor, I think I'll stop there and see if there's any questions or discussion.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Adam. Yeah, and it being online, people can do their little clappy reaction if they want. Otherwise, it's a little underwhelming when things end. Yeah, and so if you have some questions, feel free to put it on the chat. I can get us started. This has been a great overview of some of the best practices that institutions should be incorporating. I had a little bit of a question about what might be some of the reasons why institutions don't often implement these or implement them properly. Based on of course I don't expect you to name names, but based on your consulting experience, what have been some of the barriers to different institutions doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 main things. Honestly, number one is people don't know what they don't know. They think, well, my IT guy, he's got antivirus on everything. We've got passwords. We're good. And they don't really, people who aren't in information security and looking at these threats every day, they don't realize that there's 20 other things behind it that that you need to address, and that antivirus isn't going to catch everything. I say the antivirus is like a flu shot. It'll protect against known strains, but there's all there's other stuff that it just doesn't know about. So I'd say they don't know what they don't know, and well, I guess there's 2 more things. One is complacency, and it's just like, we haven't had a breach, and we're good. We haven't been fined. It'll happen to someone else. We don't need to worry about it. And I think the third is that traditionally healthcare has not spent or budgeted a lot of money on cybersecurity, and therefore it's hard to find new budget for it. And I often hear that the boardroom discussion is you've got a chief security officer, hopefully, that is saying, hey, I need $100,000 for this security widget, whatever it is. And you've got a doctor saying, hey, I need $100,000 for this medical device that's going to save lives. Do we want a security widget or do we want to save lives? And that's a discussion the security officer will never win.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Right. And so when you're speaking of complacency, are you saying for most workers, or are you talking about mainly about sort of higher level culture of the administration?
Yeah, I'm talking about like administration. They're not going to spend a whole lot of money on a fire that isn't burning, and in healthcare, that's often where the dollars go. Is where's the fire burning, and And also, I mean, honestly, looking at the financial incentives for a large hospital, you know, the more services we provide, the better we are financially. Security is seen as a money pit,
Right.
which I
Yeah,
think
it's
is,
almost like a gamble almost, right?
yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think that's changing. I think the board level discussions, they're starting to see it as business risk, which is what it should be, as opposed to just something the IT guy wants as far as a new widget or whatever.